In that case, if there are no further questions, I call upon the Prime Minister to introduce the case and answer their name.
Speaker, on side government today, we strive to achieve a political platform in these post-conflict societies that strive for peacetime politics. So because we believe that these former military leaders participating in politics leads to more conflict and mirrors more tensions that we're so proud to impose on our side of the house. As first speaker on side proposition, I'll do a couple of things. First, I'll like to model out this debate for you, then I'll give you a burdens, then we'll move on to our constructive case. First, on the harms to the political system. Second, on increased tensions. My partner Rose is going to talk about in her constructive how this creates a more stable post-conflict society. Let's first go into the model. We like to define this house as an international community, the formal military leaders as like the people who participated in the most recent conflict that the society has suffered, and post-conflict societies are defined as like any countries around the world who suffered from like civil war or any other form of like military chaos or like conflict inside the country. We feel that by banning them, we're taking a very principled stance by saying as the international community, we take a stance against this and strongly denounce this. We would prefer a world where military leaders didn't participate in politics. But if in the case that we need to take this into the practical spectrum, we would say that as an international community, we would like put political pressure on these countries who would allow and are having military leaders participating in politics by putting sanctions, by not giving them development aid in those extreme cases. But we think that it's unreasonable for side opposition to expect side government today to like have a model that completely prevents military leaders from participating in politics because like politics of a country is like directly their sovereignty. We don't think we have any authority to like directly ban somebody or prevent them physically. No thank you. Our burden today to prove to you is that first, these formal military leaders, their participation in politics is harmful to the political system in the countries, but second, it also endangers the countries with increased tensions. Let's first move on to the first constructive point on harms to the political system. We're going to prove to you that if these formal military leaders participate, the political system is harmed and becomes illegitimate. We have to first establish what is objective good that both sides should fight for. We think that as an international community, democracy and democratic forms of government in post-conflict societies is something we should fight for because A, there's the least chance of future conflicts because the most like voices are heard and it's the most fair form of government, but B, all parties, no matter which side of the conflict you are on, in these post-conflict societies, in the democratic system, their voices can be heard on the political platform. No thank you. But we argue that formal military leaders, if they do participate in politics and have significant influence, will not bring democracy. Why? Because A, they have no incentive. If they took the country like overwhelmingly with military power, they probably already hold major power over the systems, like the military system, the legislative system, or the whole like atmosphere of the country itself. So they have no incentive to go into democracy and lose power. But B, they're not used to the system of like listening to other people and negotiating, right? They're part of like, they have a military background, they're used to military command, giving commands, harsh leadership. We don't think democracy is something they're used to, familiarized with. I'll take you in one second. But third, we think they already have a thirst for power, they already have a thirst for authority, because that's why they stood up and led this like storm of like military campaign inside their country. Sure.
So do you say that military leaders will categorically never have any good traits that could possibly ever contribute to stability?
Okay, thank you. I mean, this is actually going further into my constructive, so I'll just explain the rest of this point, which will answer her POI. We think that A, in the case that they don't bring democracy, it's especially harmful because marginalized people are not heard in these post-conflict societies. But B, this goes against like the values that the international community holds. Now the second part, even if they're democratic and bring like good values like that POI has stated, we think that A, it's unfair for the other politicians and goes against like the equal opportunity principle of a democratic government because they already have support from like most people, and like they already gain unfair support from these people in civil society because they influence them so much through this military campaign. We're not saying that their political strategy and their like personalities as a people is more like valuable or more trustworthy, but they just had more contact with those people. They had more like FaceTime with these people. They heard more. The people heard this military leader more than some new political leader that's going to come up. We think that this is extremely unfair. But even if side opposition today comes up here and says this support is hard earned, they deserve this support, that's why we should keep them in the politics, we say no. Why? Because they already hold too much military power inside the country. We think this is extremely harmful because this military presence holds like an unfair ground. Like if we combine the military presence with political presence, we think that this gives a very dangerous room for this leader to like act upon his political stances and opinions with military power. We don't think political leaders should have any military affiliation or like overwhelming military power in the political system. Let's go on to the second constructive point on increased tensions. We're going to prove to you that it's more likely to bring on future conflicts in these very unstable post-conflict societies in the cases that military leaders participate in politics. We have divided into two subpoints. First, the first part is that we have to first establish that the post-conflict societies are still going to be divided in some way. Like just because one side has won and one side has we kind of settled the conflict and the government is formed, doesn't mean that 100% of the civil and political societies completely agree with that one side that has won that conflict or the government that is formed, right? We think that there's going to be still civil unrest and civil tensions and civil dissent in at least some minorities of the population in the best case scenario. But to those opposing this small minority in the best case scenario, this military leader is a directly hostile subject, right? Because they went directly against that population, they probably killed their neighbors, they killed the people that stand against the same values that they hold, right? We think that this is extremely harmful, and it's better to have an objective, fresh face that's leading the politics because they already hold these minorities and these people who have lost that conflict already hold a very harmful and very major prejudice against this military leader and are not likely to follow them in any circumstance, even if they give a good compromise. But the second part is that this sets a precedent that taking political control over a country through conflict and military leadership is viable and legitimate, right? We think that this is extremely harmful on two levels. First, it dilutes the actual legitimate process of taking political control, which is through elections, which is through campaigning, right? But secondly, we think that this brings about other opposition military leaders around the country and other radical groups to think that this is viable and who dream about taking over the country, but not in a political way, but in a military way. We think that this precedent is extremely harmful and can impact these unstable post-conflict societies in the very long term. For all those reasons, we're so proud of these proposals. Thank you very much.
Sorry for this, but it's awfully split up.
Straight off.
Having asked that earlier. Nonetheless, I'm going to start the debate off here.
Mr. Speaker, so government stands up today and tells you that they support a system of democracy and they support that system of fair election and representation. What we're going to tell you today under side opposition is that if people in this situation and the military leaders of post-conflict countries are able to legitimately participate in politics, then military coups will happen. This is how you lead to the sort of instability that side government fears so much. What are we going to be doing for you today under our side of the house? We're going to be doing several things. First, I'm going to be bringing up two points. First of all, what happens if these leaders are bad? What happens if these leaders are good? And then I'm going to be thoroughly reviewing everything that we've heard from side government. So first of all, onto this idea of what if these leaders are bad, right? Because we think that this is where the crux of government's case is. They tell you that these post-military leaders are obviously going to be people who don't support democracy. These are going to be people who have massive support over them, right? We think that that's exactly the problem, right? These are people who come out of post-conflicts and they have a massive support of a huge amount of people. And we think that in that situation, if you don't let them participate legitimately in politics, there's several things that can happen. First of all, we think that a lot of times they're going to become really bitter and they're not actually going to just listen to that and be okay, the international community told me I can't, so now I'm not going to. What happens in that situation, right? They're actually going to take power in a different way. They're going to overthrow the newly sprung democracy that you're trying to plant in that country. We think in that situation, once you implement a military coup, because you're not letting these people participate in government, this is far worse for stability. So examples of this include like Hezbollah in Palestine, right? Like they're a militia group, and because they weren't allowed to participate in politics, now like they're far more radical. This is far worse for the people in that country. We think that at least, like on our side of the house, we also support elections, right? We think that if these people get like elected democratically, that's perfectly valid. At least if they get elected democratically, we think that there's just more accountability in the first place. Why is that the case, right? Because when you're actually the face of the government and you're actively, like instead of like hiding in the shadows plotting a military coup, like your actions are more accounted for, people know about them more, you have much more of an incentive to go like the legitimate route in order to establish your authority, especially in a country that's post-conflict, that's like incredibly struggling. We think that that's the case, right? But let's talk about even if they didn't have that popular support, what does that do, right? If they try to run for election and like people in the country actually hate them, we think that like by letting them run and by letting them lose fairly, we think that you send this incredibly powerful message and like you actually delegitimize them in an authentic way when you say like it's not just the international community that doesn't like you, like the people in your country hate you too. We think that that's really good. But furthermore, let's talk about the situation under which these are actually good people, right? Because we don't necessarily accept underside opposition that everyone in like all the military leaders in this situation are necessarily going to be like incredibly horrible. Because know that when we talk about participating in politics, we're not only talking about being the head of state, there's also things such as like military advisors or just like generals, right? We think like what you do in this situation is you lose out on a lot of experienced people. If these people are like genuinely good and they have a lot of military experience, then you don't get that opportunity to capitalize on the resources and make that country more stable. Like we see examples of this happening, for example, like post-war Iraq. So what happened was the US like took out like all the military leaders from that country after that conflict, and everything went really terrible because like everyone else they instituted in their place had no idea what they were doing, right? So we think in that situation, like we're willing to trade off on like slight harms in order to get that sort of stability to lead to the best democracy at the end of the day. So going on to what we heard from side government. So they brought you 3 things. First of all, they told you that this harms the political system, right? We think it harms the political system, and this harms the political system and how we should denounce them as the international community, right? But what we think happens when you denounce them as the international community and the people in that country like genuinely support them is now these people are mad. They feel like the West is imposing like their ideals on this country and what they want is a leadership. So why is this necessarily bad, right? It means that even though the West has a lot of resources and like can help with like infrastructure and like humanitarian aid to these post-conflict societies, the people in the country are going to be a lot less likely to be receptive to that sort of help to get a stable country, because now they feel like the West is interfering in something that they don't necessarily want them to interfere in. So second of all, on this idea of tension, right? How these people are necessarily going to be bad. So they tell you that these military leaders are incredibly unreasonable people, and as soon as they get elected, they're going to have like a military coup, right? We think that's the opposite of what happens. We think that if like they're so unreasonable and irrational and willing to like screw the country over like side government tells them, we think that like side government tells us, then that's going to happen on either side of the house. But under our side of the house, we rather it happen in a way where like they're like actually in like public government. They're like the official face of the state, so that like people can monitor them more closely, so the international community can actually see what's happening as opposed to just like them hiding in the shadows. Sure.
On your side, if a terrorist leader legitimately runs and wins, that's bad for the country. But if they lose, they're going to be mad and go on a coup anyway. What's the good on your side of the house?
We think that if they lose, that means the majority of the people in that country don't support them. We think that even in that situation, it's like far harder to like have a military coup when you don't have that sort of support, right? So next they give you this idea that this isn't necessarily fair because they already have a lot of support before the war, right? So first of all, we think that if they have a lot of support, like that's a perfectly legitimate thing. Like in every election, not everyone has like the exact same number of constituents, and not everyone has the same amount of like people, right? But furthermore, we think like that sort of like support is exactly like what we're talking about, right? If they have so many people in a situation who support them, then if they have a military coup, then that's obviously going to like happen a lot more. And furthermore, if they have a military coup and like actually legitimately participating in government, they're more likely to use like force and things to keep the population under control, as opposed to like more democratic things such as like good legislation and accountability. I think that at the end of the day, you have to look at like how it is that like newly sprung democracies actually work, right? When you like transition from a different type of government into democracy, there's always going to be a period of instability. But we rather in this situation that you have the the best mechanism of implementing that sort of stability, so you can move past that state of instability, you can move past that state of incredibly turmoil government in order to get to the sort of like great utopian government, great utopian like democratic government that side government is telling you about, right? Because at the end of the day, we think that this is the best mechanism to implement that. First of all, people in this situation have more accountability, they're less likely to do shady things, they're less likely to use force to control their people, and like people who are genuinely good politicians and advisors can bring their expertise and their resources into this situation. We think that all of these things are a benefit. That's why we're so proud to oppose. Thank you.
And I ask that the MC board give the second constructive speech beside government. Okay.
In a society that has suffered through conflict, we on side proposition don't want to play a game of risk. It is because we want to set precedents, it is because we want to enact mechanisms that will ensure for the highest degree of stability in these post-conflict societies that we continue to be so proud to propose this resolution today. So as your second speaker on side up proposition, I'm going to be doing a couple of things for you today. First of all, I'll be going through our final constructive point on creating stable post-conflict societies. Then I'll be going through some thorough refutation of what we've heard so far from side opposition, and then I'll be reconstructing my partner Andrew's case. All right, so let's go into this idea of creating post-conflict societies. We think that essentially military leaders are not the right actor to be bringing this stability to these countries that are like still inherently volatile, that still have these influences that cause the conflict in the first place. We think these countries need this stability. They need good government with elected representatives that want this country to rebuild and are not like reminiscent of its like conflict past. No, thank you. We think that not only is this going to help the country, but the international community at large. But why not have military leaders? Well, first of all, let's examine the nature of these kinds of leaders. We would tell you that in most post-conflict societies, there have been like a lot of opposition, right? You have like rebel groups, you have like genocides that have been enacted, and these former military leaders are the people who have done this. We think that these leaders only represent the subset of the population that they were fighting for during this conflict. We think that this proves that they are volatile and that they don't inherently have the best interests of the country at heart. We would tell you that they are willing to resort to violence in order to establish changes. They've proved that they will do this in the past, and this is exactly what post-conflict societies don't do. On our side of the house, we stand for a world where we have, I'll take you in a moment, political parties without military backgrounds that will actually be representative of a new generation for this country. But first,
On either side of the house, the ability for identity politics to be played exists. For example, in post-conflict Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki was very terrible to the Sunni minority, even while being completely new.
we would tell you that like in this case, on their side of the house, these people can still take power, right? They can still have a coup. Like even if they run through this election, if they lose, we would tell you that these military leaders still have mechanisms to access power. On our side of the house, not only are we cutting off all of these mechanisms, but now in the case that a military leader like does violate these, we have set a precedent in this country that says like military leaders are unfit to be in politics. This is something that the citizens are going to recognize and the political system at large. All right, so now let's go into some refutation. No, thank you. So firstly, they brought to you this idea of like why these military leaders will actually be good for the country. They told you that they are going to have support from like probably a lot of people because like they've like won this conflict, the society is stable. We would tell you that this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You can have a military leader come in from like an opposition that actually like lost in whatever conflict that this was, that would like prove that they don't actually have the majority of the support from the population. We would tell you that at the end of the day, like military leaders are not the people who are actually like representing the citizens within this country. They're acting on their behalf without their consent. That's what they have done in the past, and this is a precedent that they're going to continue to prove. We don't think they've actually proven to you like why this support is going to exist. But we would tell you that like furthermore, even if this support does exist, there will still be a like subset of the this military leader in the past. And because of this, like, they are not going to feel like stable within the society. That's just going to trigger further conflict. Furthermore, we would tell you that, like, even if these leaders are good, even if people want them, like, they are still going to be volatile because they have the inherent tendencies of a military leader that has, like, just come out of conflict, that has been representative of the conflict within the society. All right, but then they brought to you this idea of how, like, a coup is going to be more likely on our side of the house. They brought to you this example of Hezbollah, which we don't really think applies, because we would tell you that in the situation that, like, Hezbollah could win an election, then you have, like, a terror, like, you have a terror group that, like, represents this conflict running a country. We would tell you that in the instance that, like, Hezbollah loses, they're going to continue enacting violence so that they can have a coup, right? We would tell you that this harm already exists on their side of the house, but at least on our side of the house, we're setting a precedent, we're trying to eliminate this. No, thank you. We would tell you that, like, coups can still happen on their side of the house. All right, but then they brought to you this idea of why these leaders are going to be good without popular support. They told you that, like, even if they told you that in the case that they lose the election, they're just going to, like, step aside because the people do not want them, right? We would tell you that this is an example that doesn't really apply. They haven't really shown us why this is going to be the case, right? In the case that they tell you that these leaders, like, want power so badly that they're willing to instate a coup d'etat for it, we think they would still be willing to do this in the case that they lose an election, right? These people have proven that they don't necessarily listen to the voices of the people. We don't really think that's going to change just because you have an election take place, right? We think when you take this actor out of the electoral process, you have a more process at heart. All right, so now let's go into some reconstruction. Andrew came up here today and he talked to you about this idea of how democratic forms of government are best for post-conflict societies, especially because they promote, like, communication and representation of the people, which has been lacking for a very long time. In response to this, they told you that we're enforcing this idea that, like, the West is best, and that people are not going to respond well to this. They don't want the West imposing its ideals. We would tell you that, like, first of all, they haven't really told us, like, why what we are doing is not a good mechanism. Like, sure, the West is best, and we think that people are actually going to respond very well to this because they don't want to continue living in a state of conflict. They don't want to live in a country that has this volatile government, that has this volatile leader holding a position of power. We would tell you that they want a fair democracy where their views are represented. But secondly, Andrew talked to you about how these military leaders are unfit to hold power because of their background. In response to this, all they really told you is that, like, in some cases, people will like these military leaders, and in the cases that they don't, they simply won't get elected. We have told you on our side of the house today that, like, most likely these people will not like the leaders, and in the case that they, like, do not win the election, there's a higher likelihood of them having this coup because they feel even further entitled to this power. They feel entitled to this, like, political process. Lastly, Andrew talked to you about how this brings tension throughout the society because of the background of the military leader, and that it further sets a precedent that, like, military control can be gained via, like, this political leadership. All that they really told you in response to this point is that's fine because people support them. On our side of the house, it doesn't really matter if a couple of people support this military leader, because at the end of the day, we see that what they are doing is not best for the country. We think that they're representative of a past that holds conflict, that holds violence, and does not hold a better future for these countries. That is why we are so
are much better if we allow them to run, and why that's actually really good for delegitimizing terrible leaders, and how if they're good, we lose out on a great opportunity to restabilize the country. Then I'm going to be breaking this round down into themes and show you why opposition is desirable. So, reputation. What do we hear out of governments? We just heard an extension from the MC that says that military leaders are categorically going to lead to instability because military leaders are oftentimes bad to the subset of the country that lost that conflict. Number of responses. A, I already brought up in a POI how on either side of the house, identity politics can be played because in a post-conflict state, what often happens is that leaders resort to desperate measures in order to regain stability. Why is that? Because I think what's important to recognize is that almost no leaders actually want to plunge their country back into war. Because if this leader was democratically elected, this means that they actually want to prove the legitimacy of their regime, so therefore they can continue on reigning longer. So we say because of that, these military leaders aren't likely to just start randomly declaring war on various subsets because they actually want to try to bring stability so that they can actually rule longer. We say that's what happens. Even if identity politics were to be played, I've already told you about Nouri al-Maliki, how he was terrible to the Sunni minority, even though he was a completely new face that no one from Iraq knew. The reason because of this is because if you were someone who has never really been involved in the political process as of yet, no one really knows you. You strive to prove your legitimacy because you don't think that you have a ton of popular support. We say because of that, people are going to resort to much more desperate measures, much more violent measures on their side of the house. But secondly, I say that we have a very interesting tension from their side of the house. They say A, that no one within these countries actually supports them. Therefore, they aren't going to win. But they simultaneously say that these people are enough of a threat that we need to ban them from running. We say it's either one or the other. The citizens of these countries either A, don't care about this political leader, don't want them, in which case we say let them run, let them lose, let them see that they have no support. Because what I think is really important to recognize and what deals with a lot of their engagement with our materials is that if you do not have the popular support of the citizens within that country, it is very, very difficult for you to throw a military coup and actually have it last. Why is that? Because every single other person in the country that hates you begins to rebel against you and talk about the illegitimacy of your regime. This makes it very hard for you to actually throw an effective military coup that doesn't just get taken over within the next 2 days. We say because of that, our side is the best one for stability, because even if you have popular support, this is what's going to be best to keep them together. But in terms of more reputation, I do we hear firstly from the Prime Minister that this harms the political system. My partner already talked about why this actually is not true. How when the international community denounced it, it feels like the West is imposing their democratic values. Because I think what's something that's really important to note is that no conflict doesn't mean you're in a democracy. Countries like China, which just are not a democracy, also aren't in a lot of wars. We say that not being in conflict is not synonymous with being in a democracy, simply saying that is an actual reputation. But more than that, what I want to prove is how the international community specifically denouncing and cutting off developmental aid specifically leads to tensions between the West and these countries. Why is that? What's really crucial to notice about developmental aid? This is literally the money that gets these countries to become stable. Because notice in a post-conflict state, they're often cash strapped after having spent so much money within that conflict. So they need that money to start doing things like building hospitals, building schools, things that actually make a country run and be functional. When you cut that off, you actually stop this country from becoming stable. That is when citizens say, look at what the West is doing to us for not following their values. We should never participate in things like the UN. The reason why it's important to have these countries participate in things like the UN is because things like the UN actually keep these countries accountable. They can actually pledge help if this country ever plunges back into instability. That is why it's really important for these countries to actually not hate the West.
In the case that this military leader is bad and dictatorial, then the development aid will be abused anyways.
In case that if the military leader is so bad, so dictatorial, we say that they're very unlikely to actually get elected. Because if they say, my first plan as head of state is to vastly oppress every single person here, cut off all your rights, and torture the citizens, we don't think that they're actually going to get elected in that scenario. Secondly, we said even if they are so bad, if the UN can keep them accountable and say, look, you are actually illegitimate, this is the developmental aid, if you want to get better, stop being oppressive. The difference between being a democratic, forcing someone to become a democratic state and not torturing your citizens, is you say that torturing your citizens is what is actually stopping you from becoming legitimate and becoming stable. There are ways you can spin that. There's no way you can spin unless you follow our values. You are not in power. That's why we think that's really bad. Now, in terms of reconstruction, what does my partner tell you? My partner gives you two ideas. The situation in which these leaders are bad, which actually deals with a lot of their material that they give us, and secondly, if these leaders are good. So, in the case that leaders are bad, the only thing we hear in response is that when you have a military leader that lost, these military leaders are going to run again, except without the consent. Firstly, if they're elected, that's the consent of the populace. I think that's the point of democracy. Second, again, I've already proven why if you want to do a military coup, you need that popular support. They can't do an effective military coup without it. Second thing my partner tells you, and what I think is really, really important, that participating in politics doesn't necessarily mean you want to become head of state. These are things like advisors. These are things like becoming a general and becoming a leader of foreign policy. We say that in post-conflict states, you need that expertise in order to actually create your country and to make it actually be stable. That level of expertise, just within government, is so important, especially so crucially important in post-conflict states, because there's not a lot of other experienced people. When everyone around you has been involved within the Civil War for such a long time, there's not a lot of people who are actually very experienced within this. We think it's really important to capture that. But more than that, they never actually engage with the idea that these leaders are so good. We say that if they are, then they're going to get elected, they need to stay. That's something that they need to engage with if they want to win this country. So, now that I've proven why, overall, that this action is terrible for countries, I want to break this down into things. Firstly, in terms of domestically, what is best for this country and gaining stability, and secondly, what is going to help this country in relation to the rest of the world. So, first idea, domestics. We say that this is where all of their material lies, where they basically talk about how a minority can be oppressed, and secondly, that these military leaders categorically do not understand what it is to be a democracy. The thing is, we've already debunked those myths. The problem is we actually went into depth about the motivations of someone who is in a post-conflict state, about how they want to prove their legitimacy, about how they want to actually become a good leader, so that they can reign for longer. Because notice that post-conflict states aren't exactly gold mines, so no one really wants them to become really rich or to become really powerful. We said that these people who are coming in to be democratically elected genuinely believe that they are going to do good for this country. When you stop them from doing so, that is when you disenfranchise them. That is when you make them actually want to throw a military coup, because they feel like their legitimate ideas are being denied. But what did we tell you in terms of domestics? We talked about what happens when military leaders do feel disempowered, but how when you take them outside of the scope of accountability, you can't say, hey, I noticed all of those tanks you're stockpiling. I noticed all that weapons you're stockpiling. What are you doing, military leader, that we actually keep within our scope of accountability? When you say, no, we're going to ban, when you never actually keep an eye on them because you're too busy trying to rebuild your post-conflict state, that is when they have the capacity to do really violent things because you don't know what they're doing, because you don't know what they're trying to do to harm the stability. We say in terms of stability, our side is the side that keeps these leaders accountable, that actually makes them want to do good things and not want to do desperate things to prove their legitimacy. Second idea, what helps them in relation to the international community? I would say this theme is the most important, because in order for a country to actually come out of stability and become relevant to the international community, you need stability, you need money. That is what happens. We say the best countries and the most stable countries are the ones that are involved in the international community because they get access to the international community's help, like development aid, like peacekeepers, like UN. Those are really rich. So, I think it's really important to note that they never actually engage with this idea. They simply say the West categorically is the best. We think they actually need to prove that if they want that to be their reputation. We told you on our side of the house, and a citizen genuinely believes that not having democracy or having this military leader is the best, that military leader is the best leader, and actually cutting off developmental aid, starving people within their own country, because note that is what developmental aid actually is, stopping them from getting hospitals. That is when a country refuses to enter the UN. That is when a country doesn't want to enter the international community. On our side of the house, we have the best country, we have the most stable country. It is on that basis that we are very proud to host.
Alongside government today, we have fought for the long-term stability of these post-conflict societies. The two major problems that we saw inside opposition was that first, they mischaracterized the civil will of the post-conflict societies by saying that whoever they voted is legitimate and most trustworthy. We think that in post-conflict societies, when the civil population has gone through immense chaos and upheaval, that this civil will is very swayed and very uneducated. They failed to analyze the post-conflict societies. But second of all, they misanalyzed the mindsets of these military leaders and why we differentiate between military leaders and politicians. I'm going to go further into that in my two questions. First, what does a formal military leader participating in politics actually look like? But two, which side better brings stability to these post-conflict societies? First, what does a formal military leader participating in politics look like? On side proposition today, we've analyzed the mindset of a military leader. We told you they're not used to compromise and listening to the people because that's just how military command works. But B, they're more likely to use violence as a means because they're used to that military environment. But third, that they'll have extremely negative prejudice against the part of the population that they directly fought against, and vice versa, the population against them. What did they tell you? They told you that if military leaders hold majority support, it's completely fine. But our side already gave you analysis on how more influence through like physical and direct contact with this time of chaos and upheaval is not directly representative of the civil will, it's not an accurate representation. And we also told you that even if the military leaders are good, that the military and the politics should be held separate. That's why we oppose even the good military leaders from participating in politics. But if we weigh the two worlds that are created on the best versions of both sides, on side proposition today, we create a more democratic world. On side opposition today, we create a better, a political platform with better supported leaders. We think that a more democratic world always wins when we weigh the two worlds. Why? Because post-conflict societies have civil tendencies that sway extremely unevenly and uneducated. We think that support is momentary, whereas new political leaders can become just as qualified and popular in the future, and democracy can hold more promise for these post-conflict societies. The second question is, which side brings stability to these post-conflict societies? They told you that even if military leaders are bad, we should at least give them a legitimate way to run, because otherwise a coup can happen. We've told you on our side that if Hezbollah in Palestine wins the election, that's extremely bad on the side of the international community, because now a terrorist group runs the country. But if they lose, they have every incentive to go back to the coup because they don't give anything about whether they have a majority or not. On their side, they create a world where everybody legitimately participates in politics. On our side, we create a world where we have some limits to military leaders from participating. We think that in a post-conflict society, particularly because they have very much chaos and upheaval and instability, some limits are necessary for us to hold the values of democracy. That's why we're so proud to propose. That's why we have taken this. Thank you.